So thank everybody for joining us today and for hanging around. If you logged in earlier, I hope you had the chance to look at the upcoming webinars. These are the sessions that I have on the screen here. I'll actually be presenting my first session on November the 28th. So please do join me. Please come and listen to me. I'll be building upon some of the areas that are presented in today's session. Specifically, I'll be talking about some of the challenges for teams when deploying schema changes, and I'll also be demonstrating some new functionality in one of our tools, Schema Compare for Oracle, which can help people do this. The final webinar of the year is on December the 12th. This has been presented by Kellyn Poet-Vaughan. She's going to look at the command line interface for Oracle Enterprise Manager 12c. And if you attended Kellyn's last webinar on ASH and AWR data, you'll know how good Kellyn's sessions are, so please do register for that one. This webinar will also be a great way to expand your knowledge on OEM 12c, particularly if you attended the sessions presented by Doug Burns earlier this year. Of course, you can access all past recordings and register for these webinars at redgate.com/oracle-webinars. Please do share what you're learning from this webinar as we go along with your peers, with anybody within your network. If you're going to use Twitter, please mention @allthingsoracle, and do make it easy for Oracle folk to find your tweets. As an example, I've put hashtag Oracle here. You may know some other hashtags which will help people find the things that you're learning about. So please do let the wider community know and share what you're learning with them. So today's webinar, we've got two main presenters. For anybody that has attended my past sessions or has read articles on all things Oracle, and particularly if you've gone to any of the main Oracle conferences, Dominic Delmolino and Cary Millsap will both be familiar to you. Dominic Delmolino is the Vice President of Data Architecture and Engineering at AgileX Technologies. He's also a member of the OakTable network and former founding member of Oracle's System Performance Group. Cary Millsap is founder of Method R Corporation, a former vice president at Oracle Corporation, co-founder of the OakTable network, and an Oracle ACE director. As always, I'm James Mercer. I'm the creator and editor of allthingsoracle.com, and I'm a product marketing manager at Redgate Software. I've also put our Twitter accounts up there as well, so please do follow us all. This webinar, as always, is brought to you by the Deployment Suite for Oracle and Redgate Software. So before we get going, everybody will be on mute for the duration of the event. If at any time you can't hear us, please do first check your own settings in GoToWebinar or on your machine. Thank you for everybody again that did let me know that my mic wasn't working properly. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation with Cary and Dominic, but please do ask questions as we go along, particularly on things that have inspired you or things that you'd like Cary and Dominic to explain a little bit more. We won't answer any questions until the end, but please do ask questions in advance using the question panel. And this webinar is being recorded, and a full recording will be put up online afterwards. I'm usually quite good at turning these around. I don't want to tempt fate by saying that. I shouldn't say that, but hopefully it will be up within a couple of days. Of course, I will email everybody details of where you can access the recording from. Okay, so today's structure, very simple. Going to give a quick introduction to Redgate Software to start with before handing over to Dominic and Cary for the main presentation. And then, as I mentioned, there'll be a Q&A with Dominic and Cary afterwards. So I'm always really pleased, and I do tend to say this when I get to this slide, to see lots of people that keep coming back to my webinars. So I do apologise, you've probably heard me talk about Redgate before. For those of you who haven't attended the session, maybe you've never heard about Redgate Software, so I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes explaining who we are and what we actually do. So Redgate Software, we produce tooling for database developers, application developers. We were founded in 1999. We're based in Cambridge in the UK. We have over 500,000 customers using our products, including 86% of the Fortune 100 companies. Within the Oracle side of our business, our focus is on database comparison and deployments. We produce tooling to help developers and to help DBAs with some of these tasks. You can imagine, particularly comparing schemas or comparing table data can be a little bit arduous to do manually, so we produce tooling which helps you do this faster and more easily. So we've got a main product suite, which is the deployment suite for Oracle, and you can see there are 4 tools within that I've put on the side there. 3 are currently available: the Schema Compare for Oracle, Data Compare for Oracle, and Schema Doc for Oracle. And you can find out about all of these tools at redgate.com/Oracle. And I've made one of the products there bold, which is Source Control for Oracle, which is a product we're actually working on at the moment. And I'm quite excited to show this screen because I've managed to persuade our user experience specialist to let me have something to show everybody today. So this is a mock-up of the UI. If you followed what we've been doing with this project on All Things Oracle or on the Redgate website, you'll know that we went to the ITIL Kscope conference in June this year, basically with a load of sketches on some paper, and then we worked with people there to create a new tool which will help Oracle developers and DBAs track and share schema changes more easily. So this is just a preview of one of the interfaces, and you can see here very easily somebody can commit these 4 changes. Firstly, obviously at the top of the screen on the left-hand side, we expect people to get the latest changes, commit the changes, and then share these around the team. If you want to find out more about what we're doing with these products, particularly Source Control for Oracle, again, please go to red-gate.com/Oracle. There is a beta program open now, and we're working with quite a lot of people as we develop this new product, so I hope you're as excited as I am. The other thing I wanted to mention is about the education stuff that I do. It's something that Redgate is very passionate about providing education resources and support to all of the communities around the technologies that we produce tooling for. And I think this is something that really sets Redgate apart from other companies. I'm extremely passionate about the stuff that I do. So these free webinars, the allthingsoracle.com website, and free ebook offers are all designed to help you out in your work. As I say, it's something that I'm really passionate about, and I hope everything that I'm doing is helping you out. Okay, I don't want to talk too much more about Redgate. You're all here to listen to the Cary and Dominic talk about improving development processes for database teams. So I'm going to hand over to them now. Please bear with us if there's a few little technical issues or any delay. But I'm going to hand over to Dominic and Cary now. So.
Thank you, James.
Thank you, James.
Thank you, Cary. Thank you, Dominic. Okay, Dominic. You should now be in control.
Thank you. So hello everyone, and thank you for taking some time out of your day to join us as Cary and I talk about some of our experiences in trying to make database development teams more effective, more efficient, and quite frankly finding ways to reduce the error rate of attempted deployments that have gone poorly. I think speaking for myself, I've had some experience as the development manager. I was the chief data architect at Network Solutions, and throughout that time we had about 3-4 years of monthly, quarterly, weekly releases of database code. And throughout that time, I corresponded and chatted with Cary about some of the lessons we had learned in really attempting to automate and make our deployments so much less painful. Starting from looking at how our deployment scripts began as kind of hand-carved, hand-crafted scripts, and then started to achieve something that could be automated, made repeatable, and all in an attempt to reduce errors and mistakes that were endemic with our manual processes around doing deployment. So Cary, you want to share some of the conversations that we may have had around this and kind of what the goal we had had about trying to reduce errors and making that more efficient?
Well, one of the things that I enjoy talking about, and my role now is as a software development participant, both as a manager and also as a developer myself, and kind of, you know, I don't know if people in the audience know, but our biographies intertwine way back, and I forget, Don, was it 1994 or so that we met?
Yeah, late 94.
Dominic was part of the system performance group that the same team that I was a part of at Oracle, and so we've known each other for a couple decades and have gone through many shared experiences both on the same team, and then when we both left Oracle we went different directions, but stayed in touch continually, and I've really enjoyed Dominic sharing some of his development manager experiences with me as I've tried to pull my team through much smaller scale work than he did at Network Solutions, but still some of the same kinds of problems. And forever, the kinds of things that we've seen out in the marketplace when we've tried to fix Oracle problems, a lot of them have come back down to application development issues. So I think that's why we're both interested in the subject matter. And I don't know, just the source code control topic of today, kind of one of the very first things that Dominic and I ever really encountered together was back at Oracle in the mid-90s. We'd go to customer sites where the configuration parameter file for the Oracle database used to be in a plain text file called init.aura, and it amazed us both that we would go customer site to customer site and we would see these init.aura files sitting in the file system with all of the revisioning done through the practice of of database administrators writing comments inside the init.aura file to explain, oh, on this date I changed parameter such and such to something else. And you can't help when you look at a file that's bloated, that's probably 85% comments, very little content. And in fact, some of these things were so complicated that you couldn't tell that a parameter had been set on line 53 and then reset on line 8196, and the file's so big you didn't even notice it. But you couldn't help but wonder when you look at these comments, is it possible that somebody edited this file at 11:30 one night in a panic trying to fix a problem, and they just didn't have time, or they forgot, or they were too ticked off to really bother putting the comment in explaining that they made this change? And there's software for that. I mean, back in 94, 95, I was using SCCS, for example, encouraging our clients to do that, so that anytime anybody made a change, they committed that change to a source code repository, and that way if anybody needed to roll back, you come up on a Friday where nothing works and you think, well, everything worked on Wednesday. Well, it's easy with SCCS to just roll back your init.aura file to how it looked on Wednesday. You don't have to rely upon the kindness of strangers, so to speak, to put comments in the file that allow you to go manually roll everything back. So that's just kind of one of the earliest and tragically extremely common mistakes that we used to see, and it just kind of lights off a little fire with respect to how many people that work with databases really don't acquaint themselves with some of the tools that are available to application developers that really would also help database operational runtime support specialists do their jobs as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Aaron. I think we found that just SCCS on the file system was a lightweight way to capture some of the things that were often things we encountered when we got there. Was who changed what when? When did this problem start to occur? Are there any artifacts that help us understand when a change might have been introduced into the system that would indicate or give us reason to believe that that change was causing the current issue? And so one of the things we saw that was attractive, I think, about something as basic as source code control is that timestamp and who did it kind of tracking is automatic, right? We don't have to rely on someone remembering to write it down in a logbook, or, like you said, whether or not they had the time to enter the comments. A system like a source code control system would give you that ability to track who did what and when did they do it. And that gives us some signposts when a system says, well, a minute after that a change occurred, it started acting in a different manner. So this, we realized that in traditional software development, they had this capability to when was the code change? How did the build break? What change caused this new behavior? And by adding this kind of tracking capability to database management, it started, in my mind, and when I started applying this at Network Solutions, it started to make those conversations faster to resolution, right? So we could identify, we got past the very quick who did what when to, okay, now how do we solve an issue, or how do we address what's occurred as a result of that?
Exactly, and it falls under just the main theme of automation takes a lot of the very error-prone, hand-rolling, hand-crafting, very dull. After you've done something once or twice, people in our industry typically kind of get bored and start to make sloppy mistakes, and there's just no need to, because there's software to deal with a lot of the stuff that we're going to discuss today.
Who is a database developer, right? And what do we consider code in the database? Cary and I have talked about the init.or file as code, and I think we all understand that that today that's a binary file, maybe less easy to put into source code control. But when you look at the data structures of a database, you could, in many ways, treat those as decisions around how to implement something, which might map to code. And so, the idea that you've created a table and then altered that table by adding columns or changing the column data types or adding an index to that table, those are changes to the overall structure of your system that I started to think about, how do we track those changes? Now, we have things like the created date on the table and maybe the last DDL time on the table, but we lose that history of perhaps who did that change and why. And that's something that source code control brings to the table, which help us assess if somebody's been making those changes in development, which of those changes need to be promoted to production. And so this idea of who writes database code, and is a database structure part of your code of your application, I've come down pretty firmly on the side that decisions about how to lay out data in the database as tables are decisions that affect your application performance and deployability, and those fall under the rubric of application code development. And you need someone who is a database administrator or engineer who has familiarity with those decisions to participate in this process of being able to track those changes alongside the application code changes so that the system is more as a whole together. And that's why I like this picture of who does database development and what do you consider database code, because that leads into then perhaps how you track such changes in a source code control system.
Well, Dom, you and I yesterday talked about what I refer to as the thick wall. You put something in an Oracle database, and it really restricts your access to that stuff through the SQL interface. And when information's in a file, you can just go get it. You can look at it with VI. You can cat it at the command line. You can run grep and 5 Perl scripts that you've written upon it. But once something goes in the database, it really becomes, the one and only one interface to that data now is through SQL. And I think the init.or is a good example of that. I mean, it used to be that we had plenty of tools that we could use, and a lot of people didn't use them, but they were there to use to administer changes to a text file. But now that the configuration parameters are really inside the database in a binary format, it's a small example, but it's kind of a emblematic, I guess, of a bigger problem or a bigger challenge, is that when you put stuff into a database, it restricts the number of ways you can get to it down really just to the one. And that makes I think for database administrators, it kind of takes their mind out of the mode of being able to do some of the standard things that you can do to files. The tools just really aren't there, and to be able to do the kinds of things to database data that we've been able to do to files for the last 3 decades. And that's one of the reasons that we got hooked up with James and the Redgate guys, is because they are a company that I've become convinced are dedicated to filling that void.
Yeah, and it's absolutely the aspect of, as we went through this process at Network Solutions, we would do things like an underutilized feature I've seen of Oracle is turning on auditing of all DDL or structure changes to the database. A lot of people, when they hear the term audit, they get nervous about performance impacts, and I'm not talking about tracking every insert, update, or delete command, or even select command, even worse, but rather when I make a structural change to the database, I'd like the action of that command occurring to be tracked automatically, right? Again, this gets back to the automation of tracking, that I don't want to have to rely on a developer remembering that they changed the table. And so it's actually relatively easy, right, to turn on audit table, which will track all create table commands, right? And so that was the beginning of attempting to use the database tool set to capture this kind of change. Now oftentimes people do this with a compare tool, and they say, oh, we have a process every week, we run this schema compare, and those tools are great from a reporting aspect. But in real-time development, it's often really useful to have this auditing capability, so that as a development manager, I can I don't want to say interrogate, I can survey my team to see what the rationale might be behind some of the changes that I see appearing in the DDL, the change log that the database is capturing for me of changes that have occurred to the structural objects in the system. And I could write scripts then to say, since the last deployment we did, what objects have been changed and who changed them. And so that was the beginning of attempting to automate this deployment package creation capability that we embarked on in the manual fashion at Network Solutions. In addition to that capability tracking who changed stuff, we started to automate the ability to recreate from the database definitions, create scripts that we would then use for deployment, right? So we would say, okay, if a new table was created, let's dump out from the database its definition. And by the way, when dumping out its definition, let's put in things like the ticket ID that was used to justify why that change was done, the name of the person who made the change, the timestamp on it. So automating the injection of metadata around the new object getting created, we wanted to automate that as well, because I found if I asked every developer, oh, you have to follow this comments template, or make sure to put these things in, it was actually slowing their time down, right? I wanted them focused on assessing changes, making changes, not in documenting things that ought to be repetitive, that ought to be automated.
Right, right. And I don't want to use the word funny, because it's kind of like that old joke, comedy is, tragedy is when I hurt my finger, comedy is when you fall into a sewer and drown. So I don't want to use the word funny wrong, but it's an odd side effect that when people start to do DDL auditing, sometimes that actually causes a performance problem, right? For these apps that, that create 60,000 tables an hour. And it kind of highlights, an application probably shouldn't be creating tables at that kind of a pace.
Yeah, we actually detected, when turning that on, the first thing we determined, we're using Tivoli for some of our database monitoring, and one of the Tivoli aspects was, I think it was space management or space assessment, and what we found was Tivoli was creating tables on the fly with a timestamp as part of the table name. And so all of a sudden, you're right, that this is back, it was creating all these tables, and we didn't even know that, because it would create them, run a report, and drop them, and so they were ephemeral. But that activity was heavy, right? Because DDL is actually a heavy activity on the database. And
most people don't realize.
Making bad practices hurt more. That was one of the things we had as an idea behind that.
Looking at trace data, I really learned to consider DDL commands like create table and drop table. They're really macro language commands. I mean, the create table, golly, way back in Oracle 6 was probably shorthand for 40 or 50 individual SQL statements.
The inserts into the data dictionary, right, to define and capture it,
And, looking up table space quota information and things, and it just flat doesn't scale. Like an application that would do 60,000 of anything in an hour. So it's funny because people, and back to that word funny, it's funny that people attribute the performance problem to auditing when really the performance problem is kind of at a a deeper level. You shouldn't be creating temporary tables and creating tables to use as temporary objects anyway.
And so one of the things we learned as well, we started with DDL in development, but then it became attractive to turn it on in other environments, because what would start to happen when we first started doing these deployment scripts to our QA environment, we would check all of our deployment scripts into source code control, and then we would ask the SCM team to say assemble the package, and they would go off and they would pull everything that we had checked out in and hand it over as to be deployed by, in this case we had the production DBAs doing the deployment into QA, so they could see, they get a preview of what they were going to receive in production probably a month after QA was complete, or after QA had gone through its process. And so we turned on DDL, audit DDL and QA, because it gave us as developers a way to validate that what we sent over was actually installed, right? So this was another check that we could use to automate the capture of what was changed in a database to validate that the package that I intended to send over was actually executed. And again, I got all the benefits of who did it, when they did it, what order they ran the scripts in. And that was a wonderful check to start with, to say before we get into any issues about whether or not what we sent over works, can you at least confirm that all of the changes we requested had actually been applied? And
right.
That was a wonderful way to, again, shorten the time, because in many of the cases I've been in where there's been performance issues, there's a, oh, we didn't apply that, or we applied it differently, or we manually changed the name of the table or the table space or in the upper environments.
Right.
And
now the hints don't refer to the right index.
Right, right.
Right.
And so if you have this discipline of saying, did you run the script I sent? And oh, by the way, when we create these scripts, they automatically spool out their log file. Can you send me the log file so I can see how the system reacted to the script I sent you? Again, it gets away from the, hey, Mr. DBA, send me an email and tell me what you saw, because they didn't have time to capture it. They used a different terminal aspect. They were using PuTTY and can't scroll back to do it on the clipboard. This automation of not only having the database reflect what it received and what it applied, but your scripts auto-log, dumping to spool files to log what they were doing, all this really shortens the amount of time that might occur with relate to, well, there was a problem, right? And we want to get to the problem, not spending a lot of time, well, where do we go to look, right? Right.
And structurally, I kind of see that, there's this very polarizing A word that once we use it, there are going to be people sifting into camps, right? Anytime anybody mentions the word agile or agile, the label means different things to different people. But one of the things that we're talking about is that developers, when you say the word developers and close your eyes and think, who am I referring to when I say that? It's typically people who are writing functions that are end-user facing functions, like the little box that pops up and asks you for your state code. That's something that a developer obviously wrote in HTML or Java or PL SQL. It doesn't matter how they implemented it, but that's what we think of. That's what most people think of when you think of developer. But there's this whole application. When you say the word application, typically what people think is the stuff that faces the end user. But there's this whole other application of how do you take the code that a developer writes and deploy it? How do you move the files from the developer's laptop to the testing system? How do you move from the testing system to the performance analysis system? How do you move from the performance analysis system to the live system? And most of those phases have so many manual processes in them because people that do those jobs historically, and in the hundreds of client sites that I visited as an Oracle representative in the 1990s, a lot of the people doing those jobs weren't developers. They were sort of guardians and custodians, and they ran a lot of commands and they did a lot of stuff by hand. And it seems like kind of the part of the Agile movement that I really like is the awareness that there need to be applications that move things from development into unit tests, from unit test into performance tests, and from performance tests into production. And all of the things that move files and compare schemas and check things out of a repository at the right version, not this branch, but that branch. Those things ought not be done manually any more than an accountant ought to do debits and credits manually. The application should do the burdensome work for you. And to me, I see there being a whole new kind of application that helps you deploy the application proper. I don't know what to call this deployment infrastructure, but and it's got lots of names, but that to me really seems to be the focus of what we're talking about in terms of, Dominic, you've mentioned as kind of the end goal, the continuous integration model. You know, how do you get to a point at which when a developer makes a change, the whole entire testing process and deployment process can be automated? And that's kind of the, I think, the theoretically optimal goal that we can aspire to. Instead of releasing once a year, once every 2 years, we release every time a feature is safe to deploy. But in order to do that, there have to be so many processes that people touch now that have to have the people touch taken out of the process in order for the error rate to be sufficiently low that it's not crazy to attempt to do something like that.
Yeah, and I find two areas there. You want to optimize or reduce the overhead associated with a deployment, right? So that if I can frequently do a deployment, then I have less overhead around, actually doing each one, then I'm more comfortable doing them more frequently. And then the other aspect is what I find is repeatability. If I can consistently, repeatedly deploy something, I feel a lot more confident that when it then does go to production, I have a real good feeling it's going to work well. And so this gets back into the how do I instantiate an environment that allows me to run my deployment, assess its effectiveness in terms of did it correctly apply, and oh, by the way, how long did it take? I mean, how many times, I can't remember how many times I was asked by my management, how long is this deployment going to take? And I felt much better if I had a confident thing of, I ran it against a copy of the production database and it took this long. And having that factual representation of how long it took really helped them make business decisions about, okay, well, we got to schedule it to start here and there because of the length of time you're telling me. Or they would challenge me and say, well, jeepers, if it's going to take 7 hours, is there anything you can do to optimize that? And that's when we started coming up with, okay, can I run these deployment paths in parallel? I've got a set of changes to a large set of tables and a set of changes to some smaller tables. Can I pre-deploy some of these changes? And this got down to the granularity aspect of creating my deployment scripts, and that's why a lot of the schema compare tools will create that one big massive delta script, and breaking that into parts that can be applied independently and in parallel, that can be a significant undertaking. If you structure your code changes, your database code changes into more granular units, you can then decide how am I going to deploy these in parallel. And to me, that was exciting. Instead of spending time, oh my gosh, is it going to work? And I hope what I generated as a change script actually applies correctly. I was able to spend more time optimizing down the outage window, where when I left, I think we were getting deployments in the 5 to 10 minute range. And then, obviously we'd like 0 downtime of deployments, but when I started, we were easily at 3 multi-hour deployments. And just this basic thing of automating the creation of the scripts at a granular level that I felt confident that I could run repeatedly allowed me to achieve, that kind of compression of outage windows. And the direct business benefit, right? Because you can measure outage time against system, revenue time or whatever.
Well, and what you've just described is that you've taken a system that has a performance problem and you've applied the standard performance optimization techniques to it, right? You've taken code path that involves human interaction, and you've tried to make computer programs out of that so that it's more reliable and it runs more quickly. And then you've taken computer programs that run longer than you want them to, and you've made them run on less time by using techniques like eliminating unnecessary work and parallelizing segments of code path that don't have to run serially. And it becomes just like application development in the other domain, except now we're writing an application for developers to use to get their product to market quicker instead of building a product to take to market.
One of the things I've been excited to learn, and I'm now on a project where the developer workspaces are actually automatically provisioned. Right? If a new developer shows up on site, they're given a laptop, but they run one command, and everything they need to get on that laptop to be productive is instantiated for them. And
right.
So one thing I like about applying this in the data world is how quickly can I provision a copy of the database that I can repeatedly test against. And So this is a relatively exciting thing as well. We started to check in what we would call localization capability. When we copied production into QA, for example, for load and QA testing, we would then apply a set of what we call localization scripts to the database. We would obfuscate people's names, or we would ensure that credit cards were removed, or that parameters that were stored in the database about production host names were modified to do the QA host names. And well, guess what? We put all of those localization scripts in source code control, because then we could repeatedly snap a copy of the production database, customize it for QA, and that process was automatic. And so I'm very excited to see technologies like Delphix and other things that allow us to rapidly copy a production database. We can now apply source code control and localization to it, and now we have a system that I can test quickly against or develop against.
Right. We discussed yesterday the example of, imagine you've got a half dozen developers who are all basically writing the same application. One developer makes a schema change that would affect another developer. Talk through that scenario that you described to me yesterday, and you mentioned Delphix. And
yeah, the fun thing there is I've had some interesting debates with some of my continuous integration counterparts about this. And one goal of continuous integration, continuous development, is that every developer has a private database where they can make these changes. And giving a full database to every developer can be problematic, right? They can't always instantiate it on their laptop or in their workstation. So it's been fascinating to figure out how to accommodate or adapt to that goal of, hey, every developer ought to be able to work as fast as they can, as independent as they can, but at some point they have to integrate. And so there's extremes here, right? There's every developer has their own database. There's no, every developer works in the same exact database and exact same schema. I laugh a bit because I tell my continuous integration folks that I call that one immediate integration, right? If they're all working off the same schema. But there are challenges there. If someone makes a change that breaks everybody else's code, that's bad juju. So I've worked through with our continuous integration folks, well, what about if we had a central database with private schemas? In that case, I have an ability to look over all of the changes that everyone's making. From a central point of view, I can identify early potential conflicts and merge issues. And if they're all working in that aspect and I have source code control for them on each schema, they can do their changes, I can capture them and then rationalize or merge them, right? Merging changes is an aspect of source code control that we've had difficulty applying in the database world, and it takes some creativity to think, how do I do that? How do I enable that capability of independent work, merging potential conflicting work, and dealing with it? And one of the things I liked about the screenshot that James showed earlier was an identification of potential conflict that needs to be dealt with. And so that to me is really exciting, that we now have potentially the ability to enable people to run fast and identify when they might bump into each other, and then figure out how to deal with it without constraining anyone by forcing them into a certain paradigm.
In a conversation that we had a few months back, I think it was at an ODTUG or in preparation for ODTUG, there was a conversation that you and Ron Crisco and I had that I think I asked the question, all right, some places require a picture entity relationship diagram, crow's feet and boxes and lines that connect entities and things like that. We talked about, is that a source document, or is that a report that's generated using some other input as source? And so that kind of led us to another node in a graph, if you'll let me say it. So there's this if you think about drawing a triangle, this ERD is one of the vertices of the triangle. Another node of the triangle is, well, we ought to be able to look at the database, look at the schema, and generate the ERD based on what the schema says. Right? So with SQL, we ought to be able to see, what objects exist, what foreign key relationships exist, and we should be able to generate an ERD based on that. Well, the third vertex of the triangle is, well, we also should be able to look at a SQL script that is able to reproduce a schema that looks like that. This SQL statement is a create table, that SQL statement is creates a constraint, this other SQL statement creates an index, and so on. So we've got this triangle with 3 vertices, the picture of the schema itself, and then the SQL that creates the schema. And the question that I asked you two guys was, which of those is really the source? There's, most people would probably argue that the picture is not the source, but actually some people might argue, no, I want the graphical UI to the picture to be the place where I do my editing, and then I want everything else to be automatically generated from that. And I think that's a reasonable request. Other people might say, well, but I want to have the SQL, and there's nothing that I can generate the SQL. I can't take a picture and generate SQL from a picture because I don't have a tool to do that. But some people might want the SQL itself to be the source, and some people might want the schema itself to be the source. And I kind of, at the beginning of the conversation, fell into that category because I thought, well, no matter what your picture shows, your picture becomes out of date the instant that somebody that you don't know goes in and makes an edit to your database structure. Executes a command that's not audited with DDL auditing. Nobody knows that happened. Suddenly your schema changed, but your picture hasn't changed to reflect it, nor has your SQL changed to reflect it. And so I kind of regard the schema as the ultimate source of truth in this triangle. But you gave an interesting answer back that any one of those you should be able to define as your source. But in order to do that, you have to have tools to generate from one format to the other. And so talk about that for a couple of minutes if you don't.
Sure. So you're absolutely right. I think the real issue is how reflective they are of each other, and do you have an ability to measure the differences in how they reflect each other and then resolve those differences. And so I've been very excited to see things like SQL Developer Data Modeler and its reverse engineering and conflict management capabilities, where I can actually re-engineer my database and then keep my model picture up to date by constantly assessing it against the database. In the script world, one of the reasons I'm a big fan of granular scripts, in other words, one script per object, is that I can take a script and I can either extract, so I can point a script generator at an object, generate the script, and then do a diff against what was in source code control for that script. Right? If I can do that at an object-by-object level, I can then quickly identify how are they different, how are they the same. What we would do at NetSol is we would check in all of our scripts, and then I would then say, okay, now I want you to go generate those same scripts right off the schema and generate those out to the file system. Then go check back out everything from source code control and diff the whole thing. It's almost like a schema compare of sets of scripts. So using the paradigm of comparing to database schemas, I would compare their representation in source code control in order to identify, is source code control being maintained correctly with the database schema as is. So again, there's that, like you said, that triangle of where are we maintaining truth is less important to me than I ought to be able to enable a customer to start at any point of that triangle, but also get to the other ones to produce the things that people want to see. Right? Scripts are no good unless they produce a schema, and if I don't have a way to communicate through having a model that people can look at easily, that's a challenge as well. So I want that capability. And what I found is that it enhances the information density of all of them, because you start to, in their schema, you record comments so they're reflected in the model, right? So you actually, you do things in each model, each representation paradigm to increase the information of content so that they can be compared more easily, and then it enriches all three of them.
Right, and kind of bridging the old-fashioned world, I'll call it, with what our more modern requirements are. In the old days, when you made a schema change, there would actually be a person that was whose job title, whose job function was to keep that ERD updated. And boy, did that person get miffed if somebody made a schema change and didn't tell, the person that's supposed to redesign the picture. And so, the world evolved to where, well, in order to make a schema change, you have to fill out a form and you have to get approval. And part of the processing of such a form is that form crosses the desk of the person who's going to be required to change the drawing, right? And you would end up with an environment that, Lord help you, if you wanted to add a column, it was going to take 7.5 weeks to implement, and people that knew what the process was would probably do everything they could to just not add that column because it's just too hard to do. So I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll take an existing column and I know it's supposed to contain the ID number, but if we put a dash after the ID number and put another string inside there, then we can use a substring function to pull 2 columns worth of data out of 1 column of database data. And we've seen these systems that have evolved from that kind of design, right? That the process is so burdensome and so cumbersome that people actually do really rank awful things to the database and to the code that runs on them, and it causes performance problems and functional reliability problems as well. And kind of thinking about, well, what would we like the world to look like? Well, we'd love to have a world in which there isn't any process necessary, that when somebody makes a schema change, some automatic thing happens that updates the drawing. We don't need a person to update the drawing. We can just push a button and regenerate the drawing from the new schema change at any time we want. We've got some kind of an auditing function that tells me that somebody just made a change, that somebody ought to reprint the schema if they're going to have a meeting this afternoon to talk about it, that's going to regenerate the SQL that could be used to generate the same exact schema on a different machine that you want to deploy to later. And all this stuff is, it takes a lot of work to build these capabilities. Now, we talked about the structure of the data, but another thing that I ran into trouble with 4 or 5 years ago when I first started dealing with this problem is, okay, so you add a column. Let's say that we've got a process that reliably enables somebody to add a column, and the drawing gets updated, the scripts get updated, the schema gets updated, totally in synchronization with the other 2 vertices of the triangle. But now what are you going to put in that column?
Yeah.
Well, obviously it's not derived data, because if it were derived data, you wouldn't need the column in the first place. You could add you probably don't add columns to store derived data. So what goes in that? And in version 2.7 of our product, we didn't have such a column. In version 2.8, suddenly we have a column. What kind of data has to go into that column for all the rows that are the 4 million rows that already exist in that table? And how do you store that? There's to the best of my knowledge, there's no real, there's schema diff tools, but data diffing tools is a much different kind of a problem. And how do you store that in version 2.8 we have all these rows that are associated with the rows that were there before, that in 2.7 we didn't have to have values for, because we didn't have a column to store them. So how do we deal with that kind of a problem?
Yeah, and early on we had a similar problem with that, and you might say, oh, we'll just have a default value for that. And earlier versions of the database, if you said alter table, add column, default value, you'd be in for a shock, as the database locked the entire table to populate that data for you. Yeah. And so we learned very quickly that our deployment process had to be, no, alter table, add, and then add the column, and then we would go and populate the column, in another process, maybe after we've done deployment for old rows that we didn't need early access to. And then add the default value afterwards. So nowadays you have a bit more flexibility when you say alter table, add column, default value. It doesn't do that. It doesn't lock it. But this gets into the, if you just were using a scripting tool or schema comparison tool to generate that, you might be in for a shock when you went to production to apply that. So this got into the repeatability of testing, just that thing you're talking about, Cary, which is how do I deal with the idea that I might want to pre-populate that data? Can I pre-deploy the column change because no one's going to look at it? Can I then pre-populate the old rows? Can I then, after deployment, deal with going back and cleaning stuff up? So we would start to break up our deployment scripts in pre-deployment, outage deployment, post-deployment, based on some of these characteristics. And then we got to, I'm very excited to see things like, enabling dark launch. So what can I pre-deploy? What can I do ahead of time that won't affect the running system, so that when I do have to do the deployment of the application code, it's already there and in place. And we used to have a healthy competition of how fast can I make the database deployment compared to your application code deployment, which may have to roll servers or change some of the architectural aspects of the application. And when it got to the point where we were outpacing them in terms of how fast we could change the schema, we took that trophy to the bank, basically.
Right. Well, and as soon as you mention this stuff, in my imagination appears the happy face of Bryn Llewellyn.
Yeah.
Right? Because he's got a solution for this kind of a problem as well, doesn't he?
Yeah, the addition-based redefinition, which is something we're really excited about exploring. I think there's it's early on in its capability, but I know Oracle's excited to apply it in EBS or eBusiness Suite upgrades where they can do this. They can pre-deploy a whole new set of schema objects ahead of time so that deployment isn't about making changes. Deployment is about flipping a switch from one version to the next, and maybe even allowing multiple versions to coexist. You can pre-deploy your objects and say, okay, well, some portions of the application are still running 2.2 and the new versions are running 2.3. How do I allow those multiple versions to coexist? And this again gets into versioning around your objects so that you can maintain that capability.
Right. It turns the time sequence diagram of implementing a new revision. It used to look like a solid rectangle, with time on the horizontal axis. It'd be a solid rectangle of we're using the old version up until this moment in time. Then there's a gap, and hopefully the gap is only a few seconds or maybe a few minutes. Sometimes people the smallest the gap can be for them is a few hours or maybe even a few days. But then suddenly, now instead of running version 2, they're running version 3. And I think the picture in my mind of what the EBS stuff gives is that we can kind of have a fuzzy period in between where the application never goes down, and some, maybe version 2 to version 3 consists of 100 different feature changes. Well, maybe at 8 o'clock, one of the features has been fully implemented, and at 9:30, 6 others have been, and 11:45, another 22 have been, and they can kind of fade in. An individual feature doesn't fade in, obviously, but collections of features don't all have to go in at once. They can kind of come in object by object, application module by application module.
Yeah. The other aspect of this versioning thing that's quite nice is a failed deployment and backing out. If you're able to enable the capability of running version 1 with version 2 concurrently, and version 2 ends up not working for whatever reason, I used to enjoy the fact that my backout script was a null operation. It was essentially I did not replace or destroy version 1. It's still available, and therefore I don't have to do actions to roll back the database so much as just indicate to the application that you're now supposed to call the version 1 PL SQL as opposed to the version 2 PL SQL, for example.
Right. Right.
So, Cary, it's coming up on noon here, and I think we've chatted for quite a bit about some of the things we've seen. I'd like to ensure if there are questions from the audience out there, if they have them and want us to potentially address a specific topic, I think we can start taking those questions. Now, I haven't seen any appear in the console, but if there's some that James perhaps has captured or things you've seen, then I'd like to make sure we get to answer them for them.
Right. I've been keeping up with the online question window, and there's really nothing pending. Actually, no, maybe there is. I see from Jason Bukata, to generalize on the comments about adding a table column, what about more complicated changes? For example, needing online table redefinition or parallel create table of select plus regrants and renames. It sounds like automatically generating SQL scripts from schemas is only useful in extremely simple cases.
I should bring up my command that generates a table, because one of the fascinating things we would do with regenerating a table was, oh, well, you're right, we got to capture all the grants. And, oh, you know what, when we create a table, in early days of Oracle, you had to ensure that you analyzed it after you created it, or because if it never had initial statistics, it wouldn't capture new statistics. So we started capturing just those things that I think you're being asked in the question, which is creating a table is more than just creating a table. You have to grant access to it. There might be synonyms that point to it. There are indexes associated with it. There are constraints that have to be applied to it. There are comments that have to go along with it. There are grants associated with who can access certain parts of the table. So the scripts that we use to create table really became more about creating functionality around the table. And since we were always generating them, I didn't have to, once we added that to our generation script, all of the tables got that for free, if you will. Instead of saying, oh, okay, remember everybody, now we have to add comments, or now we have to add grants, or now the generation of those things was encapsulated in our, this is how we create scripts to generate tables. And we did use online date redefinition in some cases, but for the most part, we didn't have to do that, even for large tables, adding columns, and unless you're doing major changes. But I found that major changes I would do ahead of time. If I was creating a new extract of data or a new vision of what the data was going to look like, we would pre-deploy the conversion of all the old data find some way to capture the changes that were being done and then catch those up later. Some similar to online redef, but online redef came along a little bit later in capability than we had need for, so we had to do it ourselves. It wasn't that hard, though. Really ended up being that hard.
Dominic, another question points to a blog post that I told you I'd like to be prepared to talk about if it comes up. And if you wouldn't mind, go to carymillsap.blogspot.com, and I think you just need to go down one page to the article entitled "An Organizational Constraint That Diminishes Software Quality." Now, as you go there, this is in response to David Van Zant asked the question, how then do you place database architecture? Your implication seems to blend designing with code writing. And I think the answer is yes. The picture that I asked you to show is the subject of a blog post that I wrote a few months back, I guess back in the middle of this year. And this is kind of the typical project staffing plan that I see, where you've got a blue project, a red project, and a green project. And on the blue project, the architects work for a few months, hand over their results to the developers, right? The architects design the database, they design the application, they hand over a huge thick binder full of application specification requirements to a set of developers, and then the architects head out to another project. Now the architects are working on the red project while the developers are working on the blue project. And anybody that's built a complex system, whether it's a house or a car engine or an application running in software, realizes that someplace during that development, a developer is going to run into a mistake that an architect made, and usually it's what I call a multi-page mistake, where the floor plan of the first floor looks great, the floor plan of the second floor looks great, but the stairwell on the first floor doesn't match where the stairwell is supposed to come out on the second floor, and nobody catches that problem by looking at page 1 or page 2. Usually the framers catch that problem because they realize, well, I can't build a staircase up here and have it come out there, right? So you have these application requirement mistakes that an architect accidentally passes to a developer, and now a developer either has to loop back to the architect and say, hey, what do you want me to do about this, or the developer has to make the call. Well, if the architects are on another project, you can't really talk to them anymore. And I've been on that project where the architects are just completely unavailable. I mean, they're too busy because their other project is 100% of their focus right now. So you end up with developers who really have to step into the architectural role, even though it's not what anybody would say they wanted. Well, they have to, because they have to build this thing. And the problem repeats itself when the developers hand the code off to the operators, and the operators run into their first problem that requires some kind of development interaction. Well, the developers are now working on the red project that the architects handed them after they got done working on the blue project. So operators actually have to end up becoming developers when it comes time to fix the SQL statement that somebody wrote, that doesn't scale, and how did this ever get into production? And people start questioning their processes and bringing people like you and me, in the mid-1990s in to fix their performance problems. And this is structurally how that gets caused. And so, David, thank you. You fell right into something I'm really interested in, because I think that organizationally, developers have to be able to do some architecture work, unless you have architects that are willing to stick to the team for the whole entire software development lifecycle. And I think that that's what needs to happen, frankly. And the same relationship between developers and operators. Developers need to stick with their software at least long enough to see their software operate through a complete cycle, whether that's a week, a month, or a year. But how many times do developers write code in March that nobody senses that there's a problem until they run the year-end posting report, which you've never run before, and the developers are now 9 months away from the project. They may not even remember what their code does very well because they've been so focused on other things. So again, if I apply the A word to this, it polarizes people sometimes because they've been taught that the word agile means sloppy, or they've found out that agile is not something that they want to be a part of. But part of what I consider to be good about the agile movement is that you end up with architects, developers, and operations people in the same room for the entire duration of a project, focused on making this application go. And without architectural attention late in a project, well, people have to make architectural decisions late in a project, whether whether you think it's caused by an imperfect design or not, all designs end up being imperfect. Anything with any level of complexity ends up having some unresolved issues later in the project that whoever's left is going to have to deal with. Dom, thanks for showing the picture.
Sure. I think back to your end too on that, Cary, one of the things I've seen that's challenging is a lack of database expertise in a development team, right? So what starts to happen is we'll just have the DBAs implement all database changes. Well, I did a webinar, WAC, I think if you go to All Things Oracle, there was a webinar I did with Redgate a while back about how many different responsibilities you apply to a DBA, and quite frankly, you probably prioritize production availability to a DBA. So expecting a production DBA to focus any significant attention on early development of a system can be difficult because they have a prioritization of dealing with production. So one way to deal with that is to ensure that your development teams have capability around database engineering or database administration, so they speak the same language as the production DBAs. They can get that, they can represent the viewpoint, and this gets back to your point, Cary, about having operators and administrators in the development cycle, because when their viewpoints are represented early, you start to see better application design about, oh, you're right, we shouldn't update that same row in the table 100 times because it's going to generate so much redo that then has to be dealt with by the operators who then curse why we're generating so much redo, right? So it gets to that continuum of pulling in your diagram the bottom bars further left and making sure the top bars are wider and span more of the time frame. There's not this idea of, oh, I'm done with this system and never have to see it again.
Right. And I just typed in the kind of an extra answer because David's comments while we were talking is this is U.S. Government Code 101, right? And it is. It's a very standard way that people staff their projects. And he went on to comment that architects are scant resources. I absolutely agree, scarce. Being assigned forward as well as the developers. And my answer back was I totally agree. I really do consider that the root cause of this kind of a problem is really kind of a cultural, structural thing. And Dominic, what's the common denominator of all the great projects you've ever seen pulled off? I mean, is it that they all run on a particular brand of hardware? Is it they all run on a particular database brand? In my experience, the key success factor is that there's at least one person who is able and unafraid to participate in all the phases that I've drawn in this picture here, from the architecture to the development to the operation of the system. They're, network, disk I/O, it doesn't matter what the topic of conversation is today. The person that I'm talking about, and I can name a dozen of them, and you know who they are. They're the people we always end up with at conferences that just make projects work. And this whole, I'm going to do my phase, I'm going to hand it off to you, and then you're going to learn what I did, and you're going to do another phase and hand it off to somebody else. I've never seen that work as well as a project in which there's a continuous thread of a strong technical and politically savvy leader that's able to really just kind of ride this horse until it succeeds.
Yeah,
I know that.
I just don't see projects that are ever finished, right? I mean, a system goes live, and it's now a live system, and it will need care and feeding and maintenance and enhancement and change, and allowing developers and architects to evade that responsibility for their baby, if you will, as it grows up is one of the main causes of problems that I've seen, where you've dumped it on the operators to deal with, the things that were basically born in development.
Well, it sucks in a way, though, right? Because we live in an era in which we feel like if our things can be made with people as interchangeable parts, right? I can buy an iPhone in a year that was made with a different guy running the iOS division than the iPhone I bought a year ago, and it's still going to work, right? I can buy a car that was built by a totally different person that built your car, but yet our cars are the same and they run just fine. But in software, the notion, the thought that I'm putting out there is that people actually do matter. It's really kind of a hurtful assumption that says, wow, you mean two projects are going to succeed or fail differently based on who is staffing the projects? And unfortunately, my experience is that, yeah, absolutely, they will. That people are not Legos and pluggable, interchangeable parts in the software industry as much as they can be in like an assembly industry. Software is not assembly. Software is almost always invention.
Okay, so we're coming up on 12:15. I'm not sure how much longer we want to take up people's time here, but I'm willing to sit and answer more questions if they come in. I had a question here about EBS, and I have to apologize. So did someone's mic on here?
Yeah, I bet you James just turned on his mic.
I have just turned my mic on. Thank you both so much for going through the presentation and taking some of the questions that have come in. Another question has just come in from Lassie Jensen. It's quite a long one, so please bear with me, but thank you, Lassie, for asking a question. So Lassie's comment is, rapid deployment really keeps developers closer to the issues, which again draw the developer closer to the operational resources. One thing which I really try to incorporate in my company is to actually have some other resources than just Java developers in the projects, introducing and showing the instrumentation possibilities, which has helped build a bridge between our developers and the DBA. Sorry, it wasn't actually a question, it was just a comment. And so Lassie also has like to say thank you for reiterating some of these points. Monty from OD thank you, Monty, for your comment. He really likes your comment, Cary on software is not assembly, software is invention. You may see that pop up on OD blog or maybe on Kscope next year somewhere.
I also noticed that there's a question in the chat now. So James, I don't know if you want to read that or not, but it's addressed to Dominic.
So Dominic, this is a question regarding Oracle eBusiness Suite. So if you are familiar with Oracle EBS, how would you work on the custom XX underscore percentage mark schemas? What about the synonyms and grants? And this is in relation to personal schemas for each developer.
Sure. So I apologize, I'm not familiar with the custom XX schemas in EBS. But the challenge, of course, with developers with private schemas is that we do have some of the ability to cause trouble, where you can have a private schema that then replaces tables with synonyms to point in other tables, right, other schemas. So the two developers could say, well, I've got the handle, if you will, on this table. Why don't you just point a synonym at that table? And then you can continue your work and see in real time my changes to that table if you trust me. So there's some actual opportunity to collaborate if you have these private schemas as opposed to private databases. But you can get into some challenge, of course, in managing the aspect of who has pointing at what and have you granted access to them. And but I found adding that extra capability to be, I guess, liberating in some sense. I like being able to not say that something isn't possible anymore, right? So by having these private schemas where someone says, well, I need to get access to what so-and-so is doing. Okay, well, that's easy to do. Or I need to, why do I have all these reference tables in my schema? Why can't I just point at the master reference tables? Well, okay, well, that's possible to do. Or someone says, well, I'd like to load up this table with a lot of data. Can I get the copy of that data from production? Oh, yeah, that's easy to do. So what's ended up happening is I've given a lot more possibilities, and I think we're still feeling through, I hate to use the term best practice, but processes that enable certain goals and functions as to say, well, I need this capability to developers to share what they're working on. How do I achieve that in the system where I've given them private schemas? To me, that's a fun discussion to have, and the fact that I can even have that discussion in light of a goal, a development goal, really gets me excited. I enjoy that topic almost probably to distraction.
So James, I think probably now, we did start a bit late, so we owed people a few extra minutes, but I imagine that now is probably a good time to sign this thing off.
Yeah, absolutely, Cary. I was just going to say thank you again to yourself and for Dominic for going through today's discussion. As always, thank you so much for everybody that has joined us today. I think it's been a great conversation and a great session as usual. Thank you for everybody that was able to put some questions in. As I mentioned at the beginning, this session has been recorded. I will be putting it online on the Redgate website. It will also be available on allthingsoracle.com. The great thing about allthingsoracle.com, if you view it there is a comments function, and you can use that if you want to put any other questions out there. Hopefully Cary and Dominic can answer those. Maybe some of the other people that visit All Things Oracle can also do that. I mentioned at the beginning the next two webinars, my sort of first full webinar on November the 28th. Please do join me for that. It will follow on quite nicely from this session. I'll also look at functionality within Schema Compare for Oracle and talk a little bit more about Redgate's new source control tool there. So please do join us on November 28th. And then the last session for the year is on December 12th, presented by Kelly Pertborn. It's on Enterprise Manager Command Line Interface. Again, please do sign up for that. You can sign up for both of these webinars and access all past recordings at red-gate.com/Oracle webinars. So I'd just like to finish off by once again saying thank you to Cary and Dominic, and thank you to everybody that has joined us today.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you, Dominic, and I wish everybody has a great day or a great evening depending on where you are. Thank you once again.
Thanks, bye-bye.